The entire first-class cabin fell silent as four-star General Richardson stood tall in his decorated uniform, staring down at the flight attendant. This man, he pointed to Walter Freeman, the elderly black veteran being removed from first class, has bled more for this country than everyone on this plane combined. Before we dive into this powerful story of disrespect turned into redemption, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If this kind of injustice makes your blood boil, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories about unsung heroes finally getting the respect they deserve. Now let's rewind to see how this confrontation began. Walter Freeman adjusted his worn suit jacket with gnarled fingers as he approached the boarding gate at Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport. At 89 years old, the Black Korean War veteran moved slowly but purposefully, his silver star pin gleaming subtly on his lapel. Today was special. His granddaughter Amara had surprised him with a first-class ticket to Washington, D.C. for the Korean War Memorial Ceremony. "Grandpa, you deserve to fly in comfort just once," she had insisted, showing him how she'd saved for months from her nursing salary to afford this luxury. Walter had protested. He was used to sitting in the back, used to making himself small, used to not causing trouble. But Amara was insistent, and he couldn't bear to disappoint her. As he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, Walter stood a little straighter, allowing himself a rare moment of pride. The young gate agent smiled genuinely. "Thank you for your service, sir," as she noticed his veteran's cap. Walter nodded appreciatively. These small acknowledgments meant something to him, even after all these years. The jetway felt endless as Walter made his slow progress toward the aircraft door. The flight attendant at the entrance, a blonde woman whose name tag read Melissa Whitfield, greeted passengers with practiced efficiency. Her smile faltered noticeably when Walter presented his boarding pass. "First class?" she asked, examining his ticket with obvious skepticism. "Is this your boarding pass, sir?" Walter nodded patiently. "Yes, ma'am. My granddaughter purchased it for me." Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked from the boarding pass to Walter's weathered face. "Just making sure there's no confusion," she said with a tight smile. "First class is to your left." Walter could feel the weight of her gaze as he made his way to his assigned seat 3C. The first-class cabin was half full, primarily with white businessmen in expensive suits typing furiously on laptops or speaking loudly into phones. Walter carefully stored his small bag in the overhead compartment and eased himself into the wide leather seat with a small sigh of relief. His arthritic knee had been bothering him more than usual today. A middle-aged white man in seat 3D glanced up from his phone, his expression souring as Walter settled beside him. The man, Richard Blackwood, immediately pressed the call button. Walter pretended not to notice, focusing instead on buckling his seatbelt. Within moments, Melissa appeared. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, directing her attention exclusively to Richard. "I think there's been some mistake with the seating arrangements," Richard said pointedly. "I paid for a premium experience." Walter kept his eyes forward, his face impassive, a mask perfected through decades of similar encounters. Melissa leaned closer to Richard. "I understand completely, sir. Let me see what I can do." She turned to Walter, her voice shifting to a condescending tone one might use with a confused child. "Sir, there seems to be some confusion. May I see your boarding pass again?" Walter silently retrieved his boarding pass from his jacket pocket. The ticket clearly showed seat 3C in first class. Melissa studied it with exaggerated care. "There appears to be a computer error," she announced. "This section is fully booked with priority customers. I'll need to reseat you in economy where there's appropriate space available." Walter's heart sank, but his expression remained neutral. "My granddaughter specifically purchased a first-class ticket," he explained quietly. She showed me the confirmation. Richard shifted impatiently. Look, I have an important meeting to prepare for. Can we resolve this quickly? Just then, Amara's voice echoed in Walter's mind. Don't let them push you around, Grandpa. You've earned your place anywhere you want to sit. But stronger than Amara's voice were the memories of what happened when a black man his age caused trouble. Walter had seen enough in his lifetime to know when to fight and when to concede. Melissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. Sir, I can show you to a seat in economy. We need to finish boarding. Walter glanced at Richard, who was now studiously avoiding eye contact while adjusting his expensive tie. He thought about arguing about showing the receipt on his phone that Amara had forwarded to him about mentioning the Americans with Disabilities Act that should have protected his right to accommodation for his war injuries. Instead, he slowly rose, feeling every one of his 89 years. That's fine, ma'am, he said softly. Another passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged white woman, glanced up briefly, then looked away uncomfortably. Nobody spoke up. As Walter followed Melissa toward the economy section, his mind drifted back to 1953. He had just returned from Korea, still wearing his uniform, the Silver Star, newly pinned to his chest. He had stopped at a diner in his hometown of Macon, Georgia, sliding onto a stool at the counter. The white server had looked straight through him. "We don't serve your kind here," she had said. "Use the back door if you want something." Even in uniform, even with medals, some things never changed. Walter was guided to a middle seat in economy between a heavy-set man who immediately claimed the armrest and a teenage boy engrossed in a video game, headphones firmly in place. The contrast between the spacious first-class seat and this cramped position was stark. His knee screamed in protest as he tried to adjust himself in the confined space. "Excuse me," he murmured to the teenager, who barely glanced up before returning to his game. Walter closed his eyes, trying to focus on the memorial ceremony ahead, rather than this familiar humiliation. He had long ago learned that dignity came from within. No airline seat could give it to him, and no airline employee could take it away. Still, he couldn't help wondering what Amara would say when she found out. She had worked so hard to give him this one small luxury. The thought of disappointing her hurt more than the indignity itself. The final boarding announcement echoed through the cabin as Walter settled into his uncomfortable economy seat. His knee throbbed painfully in the confined space, but he remained stoic, eyes forward, dignity intact despite the humiliation he'd just endured. The atmosphere in the plane shifted subtly as a group of uniformed military personnel entered. Passengers straightened in their seats, conversations hushed, and heads turned with respect and curiosity. Leading the group was an imposing figure, 4-star General Marcus Richardson, a black man in his early 60s whose commanding presence demanded attention without him speaking a word. His uniform was impeccable decorations and medals testifying to a distinguished career of service. Behind him followed his staff, 2 lieutenants, a major, and a colonel, all moving with military precision. General Richardson nodded courteously to the flight attendants as he made his way toward the first-class cabin. Melissa Whitfield, who had just reseated Walter, immediately transformed. Her dismissive demeanor vanished, replaced by deferential respect. "General Richardson, it's an honor to have you aboard. Please right this way." The general acknowledged her with professional courtesy, but no warmth. As the military group moved through the plane, Richard Blackwood, who had objected to Walter's presence beside him, immediately recognized the opportunity before him. He half rose from his seat as the general approached first class. "General Richardson, Richard Blackwood, Pinnacle Defense Systems," he announced loudly, extending his hand. "We've supplied tactical gear to your division. I was hoping to discuss our new line of—" The general's gaze was polite but distant. "Perhaps another time, Mr. Blackwood. We're on our way to an important ceremony." He shook the offered hand briefly before continuing to his seat, effectively dismissing the businessman. Richard sank back, visibly deflated, but trying to maintain his composure. As the military personnel made their way through the narrow aisle of economy class, the youngest officer, Lieutenant Jason Rodriguez, noticed something that caught his attention. Walter Freeman sat quietly, eyes forward, but the distinctive silver star pin on his lapel was unmistakable to any trained military eye. Lieutenant Rodriguez slowed his pace, then stopped beside Walter's row. "Excuse me, sir," he said respectfully. "Silver Star Korean War." Walter looked up, momentarily surprised at being addressed. "Yes, son. Hill 303, 1951. The lieutenant came to attention and offered a crisp salute. "It's an honor, sir." The unexpected gesture of respect caused nearby passengers to take notice. Walter returned the salute with quiet dignity. The brief exchange caught General Richardson's attention. He paused and turned back. "Lieutenant." "Sir," Lieutenant Rodriguez responded, "this gentleman is a Silver Star recipient from Korea." The general's expression changed immediately. He approached Walter's row, other passengers shifting to make way. "I apologize for the interruption, sir," General Richardson said, "but I make it a point to acknowledge the heroes who paved the way for soldiers like myself." He extended his hand to Walter. "General Marcus Richardson, United States Army." Walter straightened as much as his cramped seat would allow. "Walter Freeman, Sergeant 24th Infantry Regiment." The general's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Buffalo Soldiers. The 24th distinguished itself repeatedly in Korea, despite unconscionable treatment." He studied Walter more carefully. "If you don't mind my asking, why are you seated here in economy? Silver Star recipients usually receive boarding priority and accommodation." Walter hesitated, uncomfortable with drawing attention to his situation. "There was some confusion with my ticket, sir. It's not important." "That tell it." Rodriguez interjected respectfully. "Sir, I noticed him being relocated from first class as we were waiting to board." The general's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. "I see." He turned to his aide. "Major Phillips, would you mind checking the passenger manifest? I'm curious about this confusion." As the major moved toward the front of the plane, Walter felt a mixture of embarrassment and validation. His mind drifted back to Korea, to the bitter cold and the relentless enemy fire as he led his squad up that blood-soaked hill. He remembered Private Cooper, a white boy from Tennessee, who had initially refused to follow orders from a black sergeant. "I don't take commands from—" Cooper had started before a nearby explosion interrupted his protest. When the dust cleared, it was Walter who dragged Cooper to safety, despite a shrapnel wound in his own leg. After that day, Cooper never questioned his authority again. General Richardson's voice brought Walter back to the present. "Sergeant Freeman, would you mind sharing how you earned the Silver Star? My officers could benefit from hearing first-hand accounts of true courage." Despite his discomfort with being the center of attention, Walter nodded. Hill 303 was heavily fortified. Our company was pinned down by machine gun nests. When our lieutenant was hit, I took command of what was left of our platoon. We were ordered to fall back, but we had wounded men who couldn't be moved. Walter's voice remained steady, but his eyes had traveled far away. "I organized covering fire and managed to reach each of our wounded. Carried 4 men back to safety before reinforcements arrived." What Walter didn't mention was the racial epithets hurled at him by some of the wounded men he saved, or how he'd been passed over for promotion despite his heroism. Meanwhile, Major Phillips had returned and was speaking quietly to the general, whose expression grew increasingly stern. Melissa Whitfield was summoned from first class and appeared visibly uncomfortable as she approached. "Is there a problem, General?" she asked, her customer service smile firmly in place. "Yes, there is," General Richardson replied calmly. I'd like to understand why a decorated combat veteran with a valid first-class ticket has been relocated to economy." Melissa's smile tightened. "As I explained to the passenger, there was a computer error with the seating assignments. We needed to accommodate our priority customers." "Priority customers," the general repeated slowly. "And what makes someone a priority over a Silver Star recipient?" Melissa glanced nervously toward the first-class cabin. "It's airline policy to consider the comfort of all passengers, General. Sometimes we need to make adjustments to ensure everyone has an appropriate travel experience." "Appropriate," echoed the general. The temperature of his voice seemed to drop several degrees. "I'd like to see the complete passenger manifest for first class, please." Melissa's composure began to crack. "I'm not authorized to—" "Then find someone who is," interrupted the general. "This aircraft isn't leaving the gate until this situation is properly addressed." So, the tension in the aircraft escalated as General Richardson stood firm in the narrow economy aisle, his authority creating an invisible barrier that even Melissa seemed unwilling to cross. "This plane isn't going anywhere until we resolve this situation," he repeated, his voice carrying through the cabin. Passengers began to shift uncomfortably, checking watches and phones as the scheduled departure time came and went. Walter Freeman sat quietly, embarrassed by the attention, yet moved by this unexpected advocacy. After several minutes of hushed radio conversations, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "General, I understand there's a situation, but we have a schedule to maintain." He began, his tone professional but firm. "What seems to be the problem?" General Richardson gestured toward Walter. "Captain, this is Sergeant Walter Freeman, Silver Star recipient from the Korean War. He had a confirmed first-class ticket purchased by his granddaughter, yet he was removed and relegated to economy under questionable circumstances." The captain's demeanor changed immediately upon hearing Walter's credentials. "Sir," he addressed Walter respectfully, "I was not aware of this situation." He turned to Melissa. "Was there a legitimate reason for reseating this passenger?" Melissa's professional facade began to crack under the mounting scrutiny. "There was a customer complaint," she admitted reluctantly. "Mr. Blackwood in 3D expressed concerns about the seating arrangement." All eyes turned toward the first-class cabin, where Richard Blackwood was now visibly squirming in his seat, pretending to be deeply engrossed in his laptop. The general's expression darkened. "I see. So a customer complaint outweighs the dignity of a war hero." Without waiting for a response, he strode purposefully toward first class, the captain and his aides following behind. Walter remained in his seat, dignified despite his discomfort, as whispers spread throughout the cabin. "Do you know what it's like to watch someone being discriminated against and do nothing? Comment 1 if you've ever witnessed injustice and regretted staying silent. Hit like if you believe our veterans deserve better treatment regardless of their race. And subscribe to see more stories about everyday heroes standing up against discrimination. How would you react if you were on this flight watching this situation unfold?" Standing in the first-class aisle. Now, General Richardson addressed the passengers, his voice commanding attention without being raised. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. I feel compelled to bring something to your attention." He gestured toward Richard Blackwood, who seemed to sink deeper into his seat. "This gentleman felt uncomfortable sitting next to a decorated war hero and complained to the flight staff." Richard's face flushed red. "That's not exactly—" "Let me tell you about the man your complaint displaced." The general continued, cutting him off. "Sergeant Walter Freeman served with the 24th Infantry Regiment in Korea. During the Battle of Hill 303, when his platoon was pinned down and their commanding officer killed, Sergeant Freeman took command. The cabin had fallen completely silent. Under heavy enemy fire, he personally rescued 12 men, carrying them to safety, one by one, despite being wounded 3 times himself. His actions saved the lives of everyone in his platoon, including several men who had previously refused to follow his orders because of the color of his skin. Several passengers glanced toward the economy section where Walter sat, his eyes fixed straight ahead. For his extraordinary heroism, he was awarded the Silver Star, our nation's 3rd highest combat decoration. And today, nearly 70 years later, he was removed from the seat his granddaughter purchased for him because his presence made someone uncomfortable. The implication hung heavy in the air. Richard Blackwood finally spoke up, his voice strained. "There's been a misunderstanding. I never mentioned anything about his race. I simply expressed concerns about maintaining a premium environment." General Richardson's gaze was unwavering. "A premium environment, I see. And what about Sergeant Freeman's presence diminished that environment exactly?" Richard had no answer. Melissa stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. "General, while we respect military service, we have procedures for passenger comfort and conflict resolution. We made what we felt was an appropriate decision based on the circumstances." "Appropriate," repeated the general, the word sharp as a knife. "Tell me, Ms. Whitfield, does your airline have a written policy that the complaints of certain passengers automatically outweigh the dignity and rights of others? Or was this an independent judgment call?" As Melissa struggled to formulate a response, the general turned to his aide. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, please step into the jetway and call the airline's regional director. Explain the situation and request immediate intervention." Rodriguez nodded and moved swiftly toward the aircraft door. Meanwhile, the other first-class passengers had begun to distance themselves from Richard's complaint. A woman across the aisle spoke up. "I had no idea this was happening. I would have gladly given up my seat." Several others nodded in agreement. In economy class, Walter sat stoically, his weathered hands folded in his lap. Despite the vindication unfolding, he felt a profound discomfort at being the center of such controversy. Throughout his life, he had endured countless indignities, with quiet resilience, teaching his children to do the same. A memory surfaced of his son at age 10 coming home in tears after being excluded from a birthday party. "You hold your head high," Walter had told him. "Your worth isn't determined by their acceptance." He had spent a lifetime swallowing humiliation, choosing his battles carefully, knowing that resistance often carried severe consequences for a black man in America. Now, nearing the end of his life, Walter found himself at the center of a battle he hadn't chosen, one being fought on his behalf by strangers who saw his value when others did not. The mixture of gratitude and discomfort was overwhelming. The standoff continued as minutes ticked by, the aircraft now delayed 45 minutes past its scheduled departure time. Restlessness spread through the cabin, like a contagion, passengers checking watches, sighing loudly or anxiously inquiring about connecting flights. Yet General Richardson remained immovable, a granite monument to principle, in the center aisle of first class. "Sir, we really need to push back from the gate." The captain explained his initial support, wavering in the face of mounting delays. "We can address this matter through proper channels after we're airborne." The general shook his head firmly. "With respect, Captain, once this aircraft leaves the gate, any leverage to resolve this situation disappears. I've seen too many promises of 'we'll handle it later' amount to nothing." His unwavering stance was reinforced by the presence of his military staff, who remained at attention nearby. Passengers began to whisper among themselves, opinions divided between admiration for the general's principles and frustration at the delay. From the jetway appeared a harried-looking woman in a crisp airline uniform, her name badge identifying her as Diane Miller, Customer Service Supervisor. She boarded with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "General Richardson, I understand there's been a misunderstanding with one of our passengers. I'm here to resolve this matter quickly so everyone can be on their way." She approached Walter in economy, her voice artificially bright. "Mr. Freeman, I want to personally apologize for any confusion with your seating arrangement today. As a gesture of goodwill, we'd like to offer you a 20% discount on your next flight with us." Walter opened his mouth to respond, but General Richardson's voice cut through the cabin. "Ms. Miller, this isn't about a future discount. This is about dignity and respect in the present moment." Sergeant Freeman had a confirmed first-class ticket purchased by his granddaughter. He was removed solely because another passenger complained about his presence. Diane's smile never faltered, though her eyes darted nervously between the general and the increasingly restless passengers. "I understand, and we take these matters very seriously. Perhaps we could offer Mr. Freeman an upgrade to business class as a compromise. We value all our customers and want everyone to have a pleasant flight experience." Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had returned from making his call, subtly positioned his phone to record the interaction, a fact not lost on Diane. The general's voice remained measured but unyielding. "This isn't a negotiation, Ms. Miller. The only acceptable resolution is for Sergeant Freeman to be returned to his original seat, the one he paid for." In his economy seat, Walter shifted uncomfortably, a sharp pain shooting through his chest. He pressed a hand against his sternum, trying to steady his breathing. The stress of the situation was taking its toll, though he was determined not to show it. The teenage boy beside him finally removed his headphones, noticing Walter's discomfort. "Hey, are you okay, Mr.?" Walter nodded, not trusting himself to speak, as another wave of pain washed over him. Across the aisle, a middle-aged Asian woman noticed Walter's distress. "Excuse me?" she called out, rising from her seat. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. This man needs medical attention." She quickly made her way to Walter's side, the crowd parting to let her through. "Sir, can you tell me what you're feeling?" she asked, her voice calm and professional as she knelt in the aisle beside him. "Just a little tightness." Walter managed his voice strained. "It'll pass." Dr. Chen took his wrist, checking his pulse. "How long have you been experiencing this discomfort?" Before Walter could answer, Richard Blackwood stood up in first class, clearly agitated. "This has gone on long enough. I have an important meeting in D.C. that I cannot miss. I'd like to deplane immediately." The general turned to face him directly. "Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you sit down. Nobody is deplaning until this situation is resolved properly." His tone left no room for argument. "Furthermore, I think it's important that you witness the consequences of your complaint." Richard sank back into his seat, face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen's concern for Walter was growing. "His pulse is rapid and irregular," she announced to the flight crew. "This man needs medical attention immediately. The stress is exacerbating what appears to be a pre-existing condition." The urgency of Walter's medical situation created a new dimension to the standoff. Diane looked increasingly uncomfortable. "We can have paramedics meet the flight in D.C. He needs space and reduced stress now." Dr. Chen interrupted firmly. "This cramped economy seat is the worst possible place for him." General Richardson's expression grew even more determined. "Ms. Miller, it appears your airline's discriminatory seating practices are now actively endangering a passenger's health. I strongly suggest you rectify this situation immediately before it becomes a matter of legal liability." Diane finally relented. "I'll arrange for Mr. Freeman to be returned to first class right away." As flight attendants moved to help Walter to his feet, Dr. Chen gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take slow, deep breaths if you can, sir. Try to remain calm." Walter nodded gratefully, focusing on his breathing as they slowly helped him toward the front of the plane. The other passengers watched in silence, the full impact of the situation finally dawning on many of them. This wasn't just about a seating arrangement. It was about a lifetime of dignity denied and the physical toll that such treatment exacted. As Walter was carefully escorted toward first class, supported by Dr. Chen and a flight attendant, his medical alert bracelet caught the doctor's attention. She gently turned his wrist to read it more clearly. "Mr. Freeman, you have a heart condition," she noted with concern. "How long have you been managing it?" Walter nodded wearily. 5 years now. Usually under control, but stress can trigger episodes. He winced slightly as another wave of discomfort passed through his chest. As they helped him into a first-class seat, not his original one, but one that had been hastily vacated by a passenger who volunteered to move, Walter's wallet fell from his jacket pocket. His military ID and several folded documents spilled onto the floor. Dr. Chen gathered them, noticing additional military credentials that Walter had never mentioned. "You were also awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device," she observed, surprise evident in her voice as she handed back his belongings. "And a Purple Heart." Walter took the documents with slightly trembling hands. "Yes, ma'am. Not something I talk about much." His humble response only heightened the contrast between his remarkable service and the treatment he had received. Dr. Chen's expression softened. "My father served in Korea too. 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir." A flash of recognition crossed Walter's weathered face. "The frozen Chosin. Those men endured hell on earth." For a moment, their shared connection to that distant conflict transcended the chaos around them. As Dr. Chen continued to monitor Walter's condition, the story of what was happening began spreading throughout the cabin. Passengers leaned into the aisles, craning their necks to catch glimpses of the elderly hero at the center of the commotion. Smartphones appeared, capturing images and video that would soon circulate widely on social media. A well-dressed woman in business class stood up. "I'd like to give up my seat for one of Mr. Freeman's family members if they're traveling with him." The gesture, though ultimately unnecessary since Walter was traveling alone, rippled through the cabin, inspiring similar offers. In stark contrast to this growing wave of support stood the airline's rigid customer service philosophy, exemplified by Diane Miller's continuing attempts to frame the incident as a minor misunderstanding rather than the systemic failure it represented. "We at Transcontinental Airlines pride ourselves on customer satisfaction," she repeated mechanically, seemingly oblivious to the human dignity at stake. "We'll be conducting a full review of our protocols." Walter, now seated more comfortably, but still in distress, closed his eyes briefly. Behind his eyelids flashed memories of returning home from Korea in 1953. The joy of survival tempered by the crushing disappointment of finding America unchanged. He had fought for freedom abroad, only to be denied basic dignity at home. The train station in his Georgia hometown had separate waiting rooms, separate water fountains, separate lives. His uniform and medals had meant nothing against the immovable force of segregation. The bitter irony of fighting for a country that refused to fight for him had never fully faded, even after all these years. Diane's phone rang, interrupting her practiced speech. Her expression changed as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, sir, I understand. Yes, it's becoming a situation." She glanced nervously at Lieutenant Rodriguez, who was still recording. The young officer's video had already been shared with his military contacts, quickly spreading through various veteran networks and social media channels. What had begun as an isolated incident on a delayed flight was rapidly transforming into a national conversation. General Richardson, seeing Walter's improved physical situation, but recognizing his continued emotional distress, sat down in the adjacent seat. "Sergeant Freeman, I hope you don't mind me saying that your generation paved the way for mine." His voice was quiet, meant only for Walter. "When I was commissioned in 1986, there were still officers who thought men like us didn't belong in command positions. I had doors slammed in my face, evaluations downgraded for no reason, and assignments that seemed designed to make me fail. The general's candor surprised Walter. But I persevered because men like you had endured far worse, and still served with honor. Your generation absorbed the worst of it so that mine could advance. Walter nodded slowly. We just did what needed doing. Didn't expect parades or special treatment, just basic respect. Across the aisle, Richard Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of public scrutiny becoming unbearable. He leaned forward, addressing Walter directly for the first time. Mr. Freeman, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding. I have the greatest respect for our veterans. My complaint wasn't about you personally. Walter raised a hand, slightly stopping Richard's awkward attempt at damage control. No need to explain, son. I've heard it all before. The quiet dignity in Walter's response silenced Richard more effectively than any accusation could have. Dr. Chen continued monitoring Walter's vital signs, which were gradually stabilizing. Your heart rate is improving, but I'd recommend a follow-up with your cardiologist when you reach Washington. She patted his hand gently. The symptoms should subside as your stress levels decrease. Walter thanked her with a nod, his breath coming more easily now that he was out of the cramped economy seat. The immediate medical crisis was passing, but the larger confrontation was far from resolved. As the aircraft remained stubbornly at the gate, nearly an hour behind schedule, the story of Walter Freeman, the Silver Star veteran displaced from his rightful seat, continued to spread both within and beyond the confines of the plane, igniting indignation and inspiring action in equal measure. The mood inside the aircraft had transformed dramatically. What began as impatience over the delay had evolved into collective indignation as passengers learned more about Walter Freeman's situation. In first class, a distinguished gray-haired man in an expensive suit stood up. I'd like to offer my seat to Mr. Freeman, he announced. I'm Jackson Montgomery, CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. I find this entire situation reprehensible. Other first-class passengers quickly followed suit, creating a wave of solidarity that sharply contrasted with the earlier silence when Walter had been removed. Melissa Whitfield, the flight attendant, who had initially reseated Walter, now found herself under intense scrutiny from both passengers and colleagues. Her fellow flight attendants maintained professional composure, but kept their distance, their body language suggesting disapproval. One whispered something to another, both glancing at Melissa with undisguised judgment. The airline's crew dynamics were fracturing visibly as the incident stretched on. Outside the aircraft, the story had gone viral. The hashtag #RespectTheStars was trending nationwide, with veterans and civilians alike sharing similar stories of discrimination and disrespect. Lieutenant Rodriguez's video had been shared thousands of times within an hour, each repost amplifying the outrage. In the midst of this growing storm, Walter Freeman sat quietly, the eye of a hurricane he never sought to create. Would you like some water, sir? Offered a different flight attendant, her kindness a stark contrast to his earlier treatment. Walter accepted gratefully, his voice steady despite his fatigue. Thank you, young lady. As he sipped the water, Walter's thoughts drifted to friends who never made it home from Korea. You know, he said softly to General Richardson, who remained seated beside him. I've lived a long life when so many others didn't get the chance. My buddy James Washington, best shot in our company, died on Hill 303. Last thing he said to me was, "Tell them I did my duty." Not his family, not his girl back home. He wanted America to know he'd done his duty, even though America had never done right by him. Walter's quiet words carried surprising power. Nearby passengers fell silent, listening intently. Robert Taylor, Michael Cooper, William Jefferson, all gone within minutes of each other. Good men, brave men. They deserve better than to be forgotten. Have you ever wondered why some veterans' stories remain untold, while others become celebrated? Comment 1 if you believe all veterans deserve recognition regardless of race. Like this video if you think Walter's quiet dignity speaks volumes about his character, and subscribe to see more stories about unsung American heroes whose contributions have been overlooked. What would you say to Walter if you could meet him today? The captain's voice broke through the emotional moment. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received word that our CEO, Thomas Barrett, is on the line. He'd like to address the situation directly. The captain handed a phone to Diane Miller, who listened briefly before connecting it to the aircraft's announcement system. This is Thomas Barrett, CEO of Transcontinental Airlines, came a grave voice over the speakers. It has come to my attention that a highly decorated veteran was improperly removed from his purchased first-class seat on this flight. This incident represents a serious failure on our part and contradicts the core values of our airline. The entire cabin listened in tense silence. I want to personally apologize to Sergeant Walter Freeman for this unacceptable treatment. Our airline was founded by a World War II veteran, and we have always prided ourselves on our respect for military service. Today, we failed to live up to that legacy. Barrett continued, his voice carrying the weight of corporate authority. I've instructed that the staff involved be immediately removed from this flight for additional training and sensitivity education. Furthermore, I'm implementing an immediate review of our policies regarding accommodations for veterans and medal recipients. General Richardson nodded slightly, acknowledging this first step toward meaningful resolution. The CEO wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm asking that the passenger whose complaint initiated this incident voluntarily give up his seat and take a later flight or be removed from the aircraft. All eyes turned to Richard Blackwood, whose face had drained of color. He sat frozen for several seconds before slowly gathering his belongings. I'll take the next flight, he muttered, avoiding eye contact with anyone as he stood. His exit down the aisle was met with stony silence, a walk of shame witnessed by every passenger. As Richard disappeared into the jetway, a spontaneous applause broke out. Walter didn't join in. There was no triumph in his expression, only a weary acceptance of this belated justice. General Richardson leaned closer. Sergeant Freeman, we've arranged military transport for your return trip. No more commercial airlines for you, sir. Walter opened his mouth to politely decline this special treatment, but was interrupted by his phone ringing. The display showed his granddaughter's face. It's Amara, he said, surprised. She must have seen something online. With slightly trembling fingers, he answered the call. Grandpa. Amara's voice was loud enough for those nearby to hear her concern. Are you okay? Your face is all over Twitter. Someone posted a video saying you were discriminated against on your flight. Walter's voice softened immediately. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little misunderstanding that's being sorted out now. Nothing for you to worry about. He deliberately minimized the situation, not wanting to cause her distress. Don't you worry about me. We'll see. After reassuring Amara and promising to call her upon landing, Walter ended the call with visible exhaustion. Never wanted to make a fuss, he murmured almost to himself. Just wanted to get to the memorial service. General Richardson regarded him thoughtfully. Sometimes, Sergeant, the battles that find us are as important as the ones we choose. The flight finally prepared for departure, now nearly 2 hours behind schedule. As the engines spooled up and the aircraft began to push back from the gate, Walter gazed out the window, reflecting on the day's events. Throughout his life, he had endured countless indignities with quiet stoicism, choosing his battles carefully, in a world where resistance often carried severe consequences for a black man. This public stand, one he hadn't sought, but had nonetheless become the center of, felt strangely foreign after a lifetime of calculated silence. Yet there was something powerfully validating about it too, something that reminded him of his wife Evelyn's parting words before she passed 3 years ago. "Don't let them make you invisible in your final years, Walter. You've earned every inch of space you occupy in this world." The aircraft finally climbed into the afternoon sky, leaving Atlanta behind as it banked toward Washington, D.C. Walter Freeman sat comfortably in first class, the physical symptoms of his earlier distress gradually subsiding as Dr. Chen continued to monitor him discreetly. The atmosphere in the cabin had fundamentally transformed. What began as an ordinary flight had become something momentous, a shared experience that had forced every passenger to confront uncomfortable truths about respect, dignity, and the often invisible barriers that persisted in American society. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with renewed attentiveness, particularly toward Walter. The captain's voice came over the intercom, unusually personal in tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize for our delayed departure and thank you for your patience during this extraordinary situation. I'm honored to have Sergeant Walter Freeman aboard today and want to personally thank him for his service to our country." A brief round of applause followed, causing Walter to duck his head slightly in embarrassment. He had never sought accolades, especially not for simply expecting to occupy the seat he had paid for. As the flight progressed, passengers from throughout the aircraft found reasons to walk past Walter's seat, many stopping briefly to shake his hand or offer quiet words of respect and support. A retired schoolteacher from Vermont knelt beside his seat. "My father served in Korea too," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "He would have been so proud to see someone stand up for you today." Walter thanked her warmly, touched by the personal connection. General Richardson had taken the seat beside Walter permanently, the two men settling into a conversation that spanned decades of shared military experience, despite their different eras of service. The 24th Infantry had a proud history going back to the Buffalo Soldiers. Walter explained, animation entering his voice as he discussed the unit that had been his home during the war. "We had something to prove every day to ourselves, to the Army, to the country." The general nodded in understanding. "Some things changed by my time in service, but not enough. I still had commanders who looked at my skin before they looked at my qualifications." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a flight attendant with a satellite phone. "Sergeant Freeman, we have a secure call patched through from Pentagon officials. They'd like to speak with you." Walter accepted the phone with surprise. On the other end was the Army Chief of Staff himself, extending personal apologies for Walter's treatment and inviting him to a special reception following the memorial ceremony. "Your story has reached the highest levels, Sergeant," the general said after Walter ended the call. "Sometimes it takes a single incident to expose patterns that have existed for decades." Walter's phone rang again. Amara once more, this time on a video call. Her face appeared concerned, but relieved to see her grandfather looking well. "Grandpa? Thank God you're okay. It's absolute chaos online. There are news vans outside our house." Walter's eyes widened in alarm. "News vans, Amara. I'm so sorry to bring this trouble to your doorstep." She shook her head firmly. "No, Grandpa. I'm proud. So proud. They're asking for interviews about you, about your service. People want to know your story." Her voice broke slightly. "The story you would never tell us, because you didn't want us to know how badly you were treated." Walter felt a complex mixture of emotions: concern for his family, embarrassment at the attention, yet a profound sense of validation that had eluded him for decades. "Your grandmother always said I should speak up more," he admitted softly. "Evelyn had more fight in her than I did." Amara smiled through tears. "She'd be so proud today, Grandpa. So proud." After promising to call again after landing, Walter ended the call to find General Richardson organizing something with his staff and several passengers. "Sergeant Freeman," the general announced, "the men and women aboard this aircraft would like to show their respect in a way you deserve." At his signal, the military personnel on board came to attention in the aisles. Civilian passengers with military backgrounds joined them, creating an impromptu honor guard that stretched the length of the aircraft. One by one, they saluted Walter, a powerful visual acknowledgement of his service and sacrifice. Walter, deeply moved, struggled to maintain his composure. He had returned from Korea, without fanfare, without parades, without the recognition freely given to white soldiers. Now, nearly 70 years later, he was receiving the honor that had long been denied. Dr. Chen, still sitting nearby, noticed Walter's elevated pulse, but said nothing, understanding that this emotional moment was necessary medicine for wounds far older than his heart condition. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent into Washington, D.C. shortly. Air traffic control has given us priority clearance after learning about our distinguished passenger." As the aircraft began its approach to Reagan National Airport, Walter gazed out at the Washington Monument and the Capitol Dome in the distance. He had visited Washington only once before, decades ago, during the Civil Rights era, joining thousands of others to hear Dr. King speak of his dream. Now he was returning under circumstances he could never have imagined, as the central figure in a story about ongoing struggles for dignity and respect. "Are you ready for what's waiting at the gate?" General Richardson asked quietly. "I suspect there will be media attention after everything that's happened." Walter straightened his Silver Star pin. "Ready as I'll ever be. Spent most of my life trying to be invisible when things got uncomfortable. Maybe it's time to be seen, even if it's not easy." The aircraft touched down smoothly, taxiing toward the terminal, where, true to the general's prediction, an unusual reception awaited. Through the windows, Walter could see not just the typical ground crew, but also a military honor guard and what appeared to be news cameras. "Looks like your story got here before we did," the general observed. Walter took a deep breath, preparing himself for the next chapter in this unexpected journey. As the aircraft approached the gate, the captain made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for your patience today. What began as an unfortunate incident has become an important moment of reckoning and respect. Please remain seated while Sergeant Freeman departs first, accompanied by General Richardson." When the aircraft door finally opened, Walter Freeman stood with the quiet dignity that had carried him through 9 decades of struggle and resilience. With General Richardson at his side, he prepared to step into a spotlight he had never sought, but could no longer avoid, a spotlight that might finally illuminate truths too long kept in shadow. When Walter Freeman stepped from the aircraft into the jetway at Reagan National Airport, he was immediately struck by the unexpected reception committee awaiting him. A military honor guard stood at attention, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn with respect. Behind them, a cluster of news cameras and reporters jostled for position, microphones extended eagerly. Walter hesitated, momentarily overwhelmed by the attention, but felt General Richardson's steady hand on his shoulder. "I'm right beside you, Sergeant," the general assured him quietly. As they moved forward, Walter spotted 2 familiar faces that made his heart leap. His son Marshall and granddaughter Amara, both looking simultaneously concerned and proud. "Dad!" Marshall called out, pushing past a reporter to reach his father. The 58-year-old high school principal embraced Walter tightly. "Are you okay? We saw everything online." Amara joined the embrace, her eyes shining with tears. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry about the ticket. I never thought—" Walter shook his head firmly. "Nothing for you to be sorry about, sweetheart. You did something wonderful for me." He squeezed her hand. "How did you two get here so fast?" Marshall explained that they had been contacted by both military officials and the airline's executive team, who had arranged immediate flights for them from Atlanta. "The story exploded while you were in the air, Dad. It's all over every news channel." Before Walter could fully process this information, a distinguished man in an expensive suit approached, hand extended. "Sergeant Freeman, I'm Edward Kingsley, CEO of Transcontinental Airlines. I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you received today." Walter accepted the handshake with dignity, but reserved warmth. "Thank you, sir." Kingsley continued, aware of the cameras capturing every word. "What happened today represents a failure at multiple levels of our organization. I've already initiated a comprehensive review of our policies regarding veterans and medal recipients, and the staff directly involved have been suspended pending further investigation." The CEO's carefully crafted statement seemed genuine enough, but Walter recognized the familiar dance of corporate damage control. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from the assembled veterans, who had gathered at the gate upon hearing of his arrival. "Attention!" commanded a Marine sergeant, and the group snapped to perfect formation, rendering a synchronized salute to Walter. The spontaneous display of respect from fellow veterans across generations brought a lump to Walter's throat. Dr. Chen, who had deplaned behind Walter, approached briefly to check on him. "Your color looks much better, Sergeant Freeman. Just remember to take things slowly and avoid too much stress." She handed him a business card. "I practice in D.C. Call my office if you experience any further symptoms." As security personnel attempted to create a path through the growing crowd, Walter noticed the original flight attendant, Melissa Whitfield, standing off to the side with Diane Miller. Both women looked shaken by the magnitude of the situation their actions had helped create. For a moment, Walter considered approaching them, not to further their discomfort, but to demonstrate the grace and forgiveness that had guided his life. Before he could decide, a television reporter managed to reach him. Microphone extended. "Sergeant Freeman, how do you feel about the airline's response to this incident? Will you be taking legal action?" Walter straightened his shoulders, suddenly aware that his response would be broadcast nationwide. "I'm not interested in lawsuits or settlements," he said firmly. "What happened today happens to people who look like me every day in ways large and small. The difference is that today someone with authority noticed and took a stand." His simple eloquence silenced the pushy questions momentarily. "If any good comes from this, I hope it's that we all pay a little more attention to how we treat each other, not just veterans, but everyone who deserves basic human dignity." General Richardson, standing nearby, nodded in approval at Walter's measured response. The planned memorial ceremony Walter had traveled to attend had transformed dramatically during his flight. What was originally a modest gathering of Korean War veterans had expanded as news of Walter's experience spread through military and veteran networks. The Secretary of the Army had arranged for an upgraded venue, and several high-ranking officials had adjusted their schedules to attend. "They're expecting you at the Lincoln Memorial at 1600 hours," General Richardson informed Walter. "Transportation has been arranged, and they've updated the program to include recognition of your service." Marshall looked at his father with concern. "Dad, are you up for all this? We can cancel if you need to rest." Walter considered the question seriously. The day had already been physically and emotionally taxing far beyond what he had anticipated when boarding his flight that morning. Yet there was something undeniably powerful about the momentum that had gathered around his story, a potential for meaningful impact that might not come again. "I think Evelyn would want me to see this through," he finally replied, referencing his late wife. "She always said I was too quick to step aside when things got uncomfortable." Amara squeezed his hand. "Grandma was right. Your story matters, Grandpa." As they moved through the terminal, Walter caught sight of a television showing CNN's coverage of the incident. The headline read, "Veteran Discrimination, Silver Star Recipient Humiliated on Flight." Seeing his own face on the national news was surreal, a strange culmination of a life spent largely trying to avoid drawing attention in a society that too often penalized black excellence. The military vehicles waiting outside the terminal provided a welcome respite from the media frenzy. As Walter settled into the comfort of the government SUV, General Richardson outlined the updated schedule. After the memorial ceremony, there's a reception at the Army and Navy Club. Several congressional representatives have asked to meet you. Walter nodded, still processing the rapid evolution of events. Marshall, sitting beside his father, spoke quietly. Dad, remember when you told me not to make waves, to pick my battles carefully? I always thought you were teaching me to back down. He paused, emotion evident in his voice. Now I understand you were teaching me to survive. But today you showed me there's a time to stand tall, too. Walter gazed out the window at the Washington Monument in the distance, considering his son's words. He had indeed taught his children caution, knowing the dangers that awaited Black Americans who challenged the system too directly. It had been the wisdom of his generation, a strategic submission that preserved life and created space for incremental progress. But he wondered now, as the capital of a nation that had both honored and rejected him came into view, whether his quiet dignity had sometimes been mistaken for acceptance of the unacceptable. Sometimes, he finally replied, the world changes around us, son. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get to be part of that change, even when we weren't looking to be. Chia. 3 months after the incident that transformed his life from private dignity to public symbol, Walter Freeman sat in a congressional hearing room adjusting his tie nervously as he prepared to testify. At 89, he had never imagined addressing Congress. Yet here he was seated before the House Committee on Veterans Affairs to speak about the treatment of minority veterans in America. Marshall and Amara sat supportively in the row behind him, while General Richardson, now a friend and advocate, waited his turn to testify. The committee chairwoman began by recounting the transcontinental incident, as it had come to be known how a decorated Korean War veteran had been removed from his rightful seat due to the discomfort of another passenger, and how the intervention of General Richardson had exposed systemic failures in respecting veteran dignity. Walter listened, still somewhat uncomfortable with being the center of such attention, but increasingly determined to use this platform for meaningful change. When invited to speak, Walter rose slowly, his arthritic knee protesting, but his spine straight with purpose. I never sought to become a symbol, or to have my private humiliation become public discourse. He began, his voice steady despite his nerves. But having found myself in this position, I feel obligated to speak for those who served alongside me, particularly the men of color, whose sacrifices have often gone unrecognized or undervalued. For the next 15 minutes, Walter shared not only his experience on the flight, but the broader context of his life as a Black veteran in America, returning from war to segregated facilities, being denied GI Bill benefits that transformed the lives of white veterans, and navigating decades of subtle and overt discrimination despite his service and decorations. The hearing room remained completely silent as he spoke, many committee members visibly moved by his testimony. The issue before you today is not about airline seating or even about one elderly veteran's comfort, Walter concluded. It's about whether this nation truly honors all those who served her regardless of their race, background, or appearance. The test of our commitment to veterans is not how we treat those who fit our preconceived image of a hero, but how we treat every person who wore the uniform and carried our flag into danger. Following Walter's testimony, Edward Kingsley, CEO of Transcontinental Airlines, announced the official launch of Operation Silver Star, a comprehensive new policy guaranteeing appropriate recognition and accommodation for veterans with special provisions for combat, wounded, and decorated service members. This program was developed with input from Sergeant Freeman and General Richardson, Kingsley explained, and includes mandatory training for all customer-facing staff on military service recognition and the diverse nature of our veteran population. The airline's initiative, born from the shame of Walter's experience, was already being adopted by other major carriers and transportation companies nationwide. As Walter left the hearing room, surrounded by well-wishers and media, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from Richard Blackwood, the passenger, whose complaint had initiated the entire incident. "Mr. Freeman, I've been trying to reach you to apologize personally for my inexcusable behavior. If you're willing, I would be grateful for the opportunity to apologize face to face." Walter stared at the message for a long moment. His first instinct was to decline what could such a meeting possibly accomplish. Yet something in him, perhaps. Evelyn's voice again suggested that this final confrontation might offer closure, not just for Richard, but for himself as well. After careful consideration, Walter agreed to meet Richard at a quiet cafe near his hotel the following morning. When Richard arrived, he looked markedly different from the arrogant executive who had complained about Walter's presence in first class. He seemed smaller somehow, humbled by the very public consequences of his actions. He had lost his executive position after his employer distanced themselves from the controversy, and his name had become synonymous with privilege and prejudice in countless social media discussions. "Sergeant Freeman," Richard began awkwardly after they were seated. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I want you to know how deeply I regret my behavior that day." Walter observed him silently, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology yet. Richard continued, his voice unsteady. "I've spent these months reflecting on why I did what I did. I told myself it wasn't about race, that it was about maintaining professional standards in first class." He paused, gathering courage. "But I've had to confront the uncomfortable truth that I wouldn't have felt the same discomfort if an elderly white veteran had been seated beside me. I had biases I never acknowledged even to myself." The candor of this admission surprised Walter. "What made you realize that?" he asked quietly. Richard explained how the public scrutiny had forced him to examine assumptions he'd carried his entire life. "My grandfather was a World War II veteran," he said. "I grew up hearing his stories, seeing his photos in uniform. When I thought of veterans, I thought of him and men who looked like him. I never considered that my mental image excluded so many who served." Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, evolving from Richard's apology into a deeper discussion about invisible privilege and unacknowledged bias. Walter shared stories from his life that he rarely discussed, the daily indignities, the opportunities denied, the constant need to prove his worth in a society that presumed his inferiority. For Richard, it was a profound education. For Walter, it was a rare opportunity to be truly heard by someone who had previously been blind to his reality. As they prepared to part, Richard asked hesitantly, "Can you forgive me, Sergeant Freeman?" Walter considered the question carefully. "Forgiveness isn't just words, Mr. Blackwood. It's a process. What matters more than my forgiveness is what you do with this experience going forward." He extended his hand. "But yes, I can forgive you. I've carried too many burdens in my life to add resentment to the list." A week later, Walter received a lengthy email from Melissa Whitfield, the flight attendant, who had removed him from first class. Unlike the airline's official apology, her message was deeply personal, describing how the incident had forced her to confront her own biases and the ways she had been trained to prioritize certain passengers over others based on subtle cues of class and race. "I've completed the sensitivity training," she wrote. "But more importantly, I've done my own work to understand why I acted as I did. I want you to know that you've changed not just policies, but people." Meanwhile, General Richardson had announced a new military initiative called the Freeman Recognition Program, designed to identify and honor minority veterans whose contributions had been overlooked or undervalued. The program would include educational components for schools and community organizations, sharing the stories of veterans like Walter, who had served with distinction despite facing discrimination, both during and after their service. In late April, Walter found himself in an elementary school auditorium in Southeast Washington, D.C., sharing his experiences with fifth graders as part of this program. The children listened with rapt attention as he described Korea's brutal cold, the terror of combat, and the bonds formed with fellow soldiers, regardless of background. "We were all just trying to stay alive and keep each other safe," he explained. "When the bullets are flying, nobody cares what color you are." After his presentation, a young black girl raised her hand. "My sister wants to join the army when she grows up. Is it better now than when you were a soldier?" Walter considered the question thoughtfully. "It's better," he acknowledged. "Not perfect, but better. And it gets better when good people demand better." That evening, Amara shared news that stunned Walter. Inspired by his example and the renewed appreciation for his service, she had decided to apply for officer candidate school. "I've been working as a nurse for 5 years, Grandpa," she explained. "The military needs medical officers, and I want to serve like you did." Walter's emotions were complex: pride in her decision mixed with concern about the challenges she might face. Yet he recognized that her generation would enter service with advantages and protections his had lacked, due in part to the battles fought by veterans like himself. The culmination of Walter's unexpected journey into the public eye came 1 year after the flight incident, when he received an invitation to the White House. There, in the East Room, surrounded by his family and fellow veterans, Walter Freeman was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his lifetime of service, both in uniform during Korea and in the quiet dignity with which he had navigated decades of discrimination afterward. The citation noted that his recent public stand had sparked a national conversation about respect, recognition, and the ongoing struggles faced by minority veterans. As he accepted the medal, Walter thought of the friends he'd lost in Korea, wondering what they would make of this moment. He thought of Evelyn, who had always believed he deserved more recognition than the world had given him. And he thought of his younger self, the 20-year-old who had boarded a troop ship to a distant war, determined to serve a country that often refused to serve him in return. Exactly 1 year after the incident, Walter boarded another transcontinental airlines flight, this time with Amara Marshall and his 2 great-grandchildren, accompanying him to a veterans reunion in San Francisco. As he entered the first-class cabin, the entire crew and all passengers rose in respectful silence. The captain personally welcomed him aboard, and a small plaque had been installed on seat 3C, Walter's original seat, from that fateful day, commemorating the changes his experience had inspired. Has this story about Walter Freeman's journey touched you today? Comment below with what aspect of his dignity and resilience inspired you most. If you believe all veterans deserve respect, regardless of race or background, hit that like button to help this message reach more people. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about unsung American heroes whose quiet dignity changed our nation. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear about Walter's legacy. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, sometimes the most powerful change comes from those who never sought the spotlight but stood firm when it found them. Walter Freeman's story reminds us that dignity isn't granted by status or seat assignments. It's an inherent right that no one should have to fight for. His journey shows how institutional racism often hides behind policies and customer comfort, perpetuating discrimination even decades after military service. The contrast between Walter's quiet endurance and General Richardson's bold intervention demonstrates 2 valid approaches to confronting injustice: patient dignity and decisive action. Both have their place in the struggle for equality. Perhaps most powerful is how Walter transformed personal humiliation into systemic change, affecting policies that will protect countless future veterans. His willingness to forgive Richard and educate rather than condemn shows extraordinary grace. The ripple effects from Amara's decision to serve to Richard's personal reckoning to national policy shifts prove that even at 89, one person's stand for respect can catalyze transformation. Walter's legacy teaches us that it's never too late to demand the dignity you deserve and never too early to recognize the dignity others deserve. Has a veteran in your life ever faced disrespect or discrimination? Share their story in the comments below to honor their service. If Walter's quiet dignity and remarkable forgiveness touched your heart, hit that like button to help more people discover his powerful journey. Subscribe to see more untold stories of courage and resilience that changed America for the better. And please share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that standing up for respect, whether through quiet dignity or bold intervention, creates ripples that can transform a nation. Thank you for witnessing Walter Freeman's journey with us today. May we all find the courage to stand tall when faced with injustice and the wisdom to create meaningful change rather than simply seeking revenge.